Sometimes all a fighter needs is that one exceptional performance to see them catapulted into MMA superstardom. Whether that be dethroning established UFC royalty, executing a flawless performance inside of the octagon, or debuting a new technique which sends fans into a frenzy, there are a number of different ways that an athlete can announce themselves as a potential star. The beauty of combat sports, as opposed to many team sports, is that it only takes one fight or a moment of brilliance to completely change the course of an entire career. I'm Gareth from WhatCulture Combat, and here are 8 star-making performances in the UFC. Number 8. George St. Pierre vs Matt Serra 2. When George St. Pierre was defeated by Matt Serra back at UFC 69 in what is still considered to be one of the biggest upsets in the history of mixed martial arts, many were quick to question whether he had the fortitude to compete at the elite level of the sport. GSP had been dethroned right as it appeared that his reign as UFC welterweight champion was about to commence. GSP comprehensively outgrappled distinguished wrestler Josh Koscheck to resume his ascent up the welterweight rankings in the aftermath. Then the Canadian stepped in and defeated Matt Hughes via submission to win the UFC interim welterweight championship and put himself in prime position for the rematch with Serra. When GSP finally got his opportunity to exact revenge at UFC 83, he was relentless. GSP showed no fear of Serra's knockout power before securing the takedown and forcing the referee to call a stop to the contest after a barrage of knees to his prone opponent in the second round. He'd unified the welterweight championship and banished any claims that he couldn't hang with the elite. Number 7. Conor McGregor vs Chad Mendes. Conor McGregor's ascent up the UFC ranks was punctuated with a series of unforgettable performances that all would have had a decent case for making this list. But throughout Conor's early UFC run, a consistent criticism emerged regarding his fighting style. Much like many of his European counterparts in the organisation, McGregor had no wrestling training prior to his MMA career, and conventional wisdom stated that a high-level wrestler could neutralise the Irishman's power by outgrappling him. When Jose Aldo dropped out of UFC 189 due to injury and NCAA All-American Chad Mendes stepped up on short notice, the MMA world was about to find out whether McGregor could successfully stop a wrestler. McGregor would prove the doubters wrong in emphatic fashion. Max successfully mitigated damage taken from ground and pound before punishing his opponent with stabbing body shots when they returned to their feet. As the second round neared its end, the American attempted a guillotine choke, but McGregor expertly rolled and disengaged. Once back in striking range, Conor blasted an exhausted Mendes with kicks before landing his trademark left straight against the cage and forcing referee Herb Dean to stop the fight. As McGregor held the UFC interim featherweight championship above his head in celebration, it was clear that a star of unprecedented size had just been born. Number 6. Nate Diaz vs Conor McGregor. Though Nate Diaz's performance may have not come as much of a shock to him or many hardcore MMA fans, his victory as a last-minute replacement over Conor McGregor at UFC 196 reverberated across the combat sports world. The timing of Diaz getting the McGregor fight was perfect from a business perspective. After all, Diaz had famously called out McGregor in an expletive-ridden tirade following his previous fight. However, when the UFC called Diaz to step in with just 11 days until the fight, he was enjoying a holiday in Mexico and hadn't even been training regularly. After a press conference that included some of the most quotable lines in MMA history, the stage was set for the pair to collide at UFC 196. In the first 5 minutes, McGregor exhausted his varied striking attack, barraging the often hittable Diaz with a variety of kicks and punches. Diaz's vaunted toughness held out throughout though, and as the bell sounded for the end of the round, the tide appeared to be turning. With just over a minute remaining in the second round, Conor shot in for a takedown, taking him right into the elite-level jiu-jitsu game of Diaz. After a failed guillotine attempt, Diaz successfully transitioned to a rear naked choke and handed McGregor his first defeat in the UFC, propelling himself into superstardom overnight. Number 5. Jon Jones vs Stephan Bonnar. Jon Jones was less than a year removed from his MMA debut when his performance against UFC mainstay and Ultimate Fighter alumni Stephan Bonnar turned heads across the world of mixed martial arts. In the early stages of his career, Jones didn't have any particularly impressive pre-MMA accolades to speak of. Instead, it was his physical attributes that most were touting going into his early bouts. Physical attributes alone, however, are not going to take you to the top of the UFC, but they definitely help. For a relative novice, Jones's performance against Bonnar was nothing short of unbelievable. In the first round, he faked changing levels to make Bonnar think he was going to attempt a takedown, before unleashing one of the most spectacular strikes in the history of the UFC with a spinning back elbow. I'm not going to try that because I may pop a hip. Jones would continue to dominate the first 2 rounds before gassing in the third. Later, attributing his exhaustion to being inexperienced and attempting to finish the fight early, Jones would still do enough to earn an uncontentious unanimous decision victory. This fight against Bonnar showed the world the first glimpses of his unlimited potential. He's done alright since. Number 4, Amanda Nunes versus Ronda Rousey. Ronda Rousey is unquestionably the biggest star in the history of women's MMA, and likely in all of combat sports. But biggest doesn't necessarily mean best. By the time she faced Rousey in 2016, Amanda Nunes had already captured the UFC Women's Bantamweight Championship with a dominating performance against Miesha Tate at the flagship UFC 200 event to become the first LGBT champion in the organization's history. Yet, Rousey's return at UFC 207 meant the return of mainstream spotlight on the women's bantamweight division, and Nunes did not waste her opportunity to finally showcase her skills while in the limelight. Capitalizing on Ronda's porous striking defense, the Lioness was relentless with her attack from the opening bell, completely disregarding her opponent's vaunted judo skills and peppering the former champion with a series of combinations that Rousey had seemingly no answer for. Just 48 seconds into the first round, referee Herb Dean had seen enough and mercilessly stepped in to avoid Rousey taking any further punishment. Nunes had cleared the division of its most recognizable star, allowing the Brazilian to start earning more mainstream recognition for her own considerable achievements inside of the octagon. Number 3, Khabib Nurmagomedov versus Michael Johnson. When Khabib Nurmagomedov entered the cage to compete on the prelims of UFC 205, he'd already amassed a perfect record in his 7 visits to the octagon. His fight versus Michael Johnson represented the quintessential striker versus grappler matchup. However, the Dagestan Russian's grappling heavy style had meant that he was yet to endear himself with a large portion of the UFC fanbase. That would all change with Khabib's performance on the biggest fight card of 2016. Khabib was furious about being snubbed for a UFC lightweight championship shot against then-champion Eddie Alvarez, calling Conor McGregor leapfrogging him for a title shot a freak show. Khabib used this to his advantage, however, and it was clear that when stepping in the cage at UFC 205, he was carrying more than a little residual anger into the fight. The Eagle comprehensively out-grappled his opponent, using his trademark suffocating positional control to rain down heavy strikes before finishing with a Kimura in the third round. What made this performance so noteworthy, however, was the way Khabib smack-talked his opponent during the fight itself. With Johnson near defenseless against the cage, Khabib pleaded with him to surrender while asserting that he deserved to fight for the title. Though the fight wouldn't secure an immediate title shot for Khabib, his trash talk offered many fans their first insight into the personality behind this great fighter. Something we saw again in his battle against McGregor a few years later. Number 2, Israel Adesanya versus Kelvin Gastelum. Israel Adesanya made waves in the UFC following his long-awaited entry into the organization in 2018, after being long considered one of the greatest kickboxers in the world thanks to prolonged success in Glory. Despite several incredible performances in his initial stint in the organization, it would be a fight that Adesanya was often in danger of losing that would ultimately take him to the next level in terms of popularity. Adesanya would face off with Kelvin Gastelum with the interim middleweight title on the line. The fight showed that both men were well versed in all aspects of MMA in a back-and-forth battle. Stylebender's words at the start of the 5th round, claiming that he was willing to die in pursuit of the victory, were entirely serious, and the fight reached an intensity level in those closing stages that would go on to earn it the Fight of the Year award in most MMA fans and publications' yearly roundups. When the judges' scorecards were revealed, Adesanya was awarded the decision, giving him his first ever taste of UFC gold. His legacy as a fighter that would put it all on the line in the pursuit of victory had been enshrined in this epic performance against Gastelum. Number 1, Jorge Masvidal versus Ben Askren. Jorge Masvidal made his MMA debut way back in 2003, during a time when many of the other inductees on this list were still in school. And he has since gone on to have nearly 50 fights across MMA and boxing. After becoming part of the UFC roster following Zuffa's acquisition of Strikeforce in 2011, Masvidal routinely showcased showcased his varied skill set without ever getting his big break. Masvidal would get that from Ben Askren, an undefeated wrestler with an uncanny ability to get under his opponent's skin. When the cage door closed behind them, Masvidal wasted no time engaging his opponents. Immediately as the fight began, Masvidal charged straight towards an oncoming Askren before unleashing one of the most brutal flying knees in the history of MMA, connecting perfectly and leaving Askren completely unconscious after a record-breaking 5 seconds. Masvidal's stock would only go up from here, but he has only Askren and his knee to thank for putting him on the map. What performance do you feel created a star in the UFC? Let us know all about them in the comments section below, and do not forget to like, share and click on that subscribe button. I've been Gareth from WhatCulture Combat, thank you very much for watching and I'm sure I'll see you soon.